So I saw like a couple of your works, including I read because it's a big book, American Metaphysical, because this is a very big book. I read couple of chapters, but then I realized actually you are not necessarily interested in American theosophical slash esoteric literature, but you are also expert in mythology. And
Mhm,
I personally let me tell you a little bit of my background. I came from Bangladesh, to be specific.
mhm,
And in Bangladesh, we have different kind of mythology. In our school, college, we almost never heard of like Greek mythology. Very little, because we
mhm,
have our own rich mythology, like Hindu
mhm,
mythology, Buddhist mythology, etc., etc.
mhm,
But as I was growing up, came to US to study, then I realized even the philosophy, like if you go beyond philosophy, then only thing remains is the mythology, because it's like
mhm,
1,000, maybe 1,500 years older than earliest philosophy.
mhm,
So that gave me a little bit of respect that in the old time, people actually told the story of mythology by the same people who gave us philosophy later. So
mhm,
it's the same story. So it's not just a random fairy tale. So
mhm.
mythology has some real value. So so let's talk about mythology. Why you explore mythology as a part of your esoteric and theosophical inquiry. So are they connected somehow?
I've always been very interested in mythology, even as a child. Any kind of mythology that I ran across, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Hindu, Native American, always fascinated by this language because it's a language of symbols. And it's like dreams. It can have multiple meanings in ways that dogma usually doesn't, although it sometimes does as well. The mythology also, as you mentioned, borderlines on fairy tale. And so it borderlines on what would later be known as the unconscious, once Freud named it that. And it provides kind of um, a record of human experience and of the distillation of wisdom into symbolic language. So Manly Hall was very interested in that, and I definitely caught that from him and his interpretations, and also just his eagerness and excitement about mythology and about the wisdom of the ancients, who he believed were no less intelligent than we. And he felt that, in fact, they may have had a greater grasp on certain aspects of life because they weren't as deeply immersed in materialism and politics and such.
Okay, okay. So we are not strangers. So many wise people already suggested that somehow mythology is important. So my background is strictly academic. So I do
Hmm.
podcasts just for my passion. But I'm a physician by training. I'm
Hmm.
practicing here. And
Hmm.
also I have a PhD in neuroscience.
Mm,
But
wow.
yeah, when I studied neuroscience, at the end, everybody was interested in learning and memory. That's the core of neuroscience. That how
Hmm.
do we know what we know and how do we remember? So even you go
Hmm.
to cellular level, it remains a mystery or black box,
Hmm.
like qualia, like right?
Hmm.
So then I realized actually the problem that I'm trying to solve or trying to learn is not solvable by strict science, because
Right.
by the time you go in cellular molecular level, even at that level, there is a black box
Right.
uh, that we know as memory and remembrance. And I know you have particular understanding about remembrance in
Hmm.
relation with Dionysus and in
Hmm.
relation to Greek mythology. They're trying to tell you a story that is captured from unconscious. So it's not
Hmm.
a voluntary, like a declarative memory, rather like dream quality of memory. That doesn't mean it's totally invalid.
Right.
So that was the main interest from my
Well,
side.
let's talk about that because it's fascinating. I think the connections and the transformations that occur in the worship of Dionysius and its connection to Pythagoras potentially. And then when you're talking about memory and you get into the reform of the Dionysian religion as Orphism, probably orchestrated by the Pythagoreans, you get deeply into this idea of memory and the idea that the essence of spiritual evolution is recovering the memory of who you are, of what you really are. Yet this is so different from how the religion originates, right? It's obviously it's an attempt to civilize, and I think it's also an attempt to develop a civic religion as opposed to a rural religion. And as a god, Dionysius is very interesting because he's always considered an outsider. He came from somewhere else. And we have stories in Greece where he's from India. That's the most common. We have stories that he's from the Middle East. We have stories that he was Phoenician, that he was Thracian in northern Greece, which wasn't even really considered a part of Greek culture by most of the Peloponnese. And so you've got a god who may have come from somewhere else, but who is established and visible in Greece as early as any other god. Very early, like 1600 BC, we're seeing indications there. By 700 BC, very well established as a religion and as a presence. And by 600 BC, we have this incredible moment where the Athenians decide to bring Dionysius into their pantheon of gods, and they create this temple that includes a theater. And so they will celebrate at first only tragedies, but later tragedies and comedies in this theater as part of this celebration for Dionysius. And of course, there you have the incredible play by Euripides, the Bacchae, where he gives you this disturbing and yet evocative portrait, so not Greek in a way, where briefly for your listeners and your viewers, we have the king named Pentheus, who's a model of manly virtue. He's a Greek male, an Olympian. He wants to be a hero. He's a soldier. He's a strong politician. He runs his country with an iron fist. And all of a sudden, the women in his country go kind of crazy. They all start disappearing and going up into the mountains. And they're celebrating this god, Dionysius, who apparently is going to show up in town any day. So Pentheus sees a guy walk into town, an effeminate young male with an entourage, and he's carrying a pine cone on a fennel stalk, which is obviously a phallic symbol. And he's got around him just to Pentheus the dregs of society, people who are just all about intoxication and sex, and it's like a 1960s band coming through town or something. And so Pentheus throws him in jail, and he doesn't want this influence on his city. And this person who Pentheus says is a priest of the god, but who declares himself to be the god, but yet refers to the god in a third person sometimes, well, says to Pentheus, "You're going to regret this because the god will show himself, he will show his power." And well, what happens is there's an earthquake that knocks down the jail that Dionysius is imprisoned in. Well, Pentheus is furious at this show of allegedly divine power, and he's very, very curious about what the women are doing. He seems to be in shock, even though the Greeks didn't really have that concept at the time, because he starts talking to the escaped Dionysius. He gets interested. He said, "Well, what are the women doing up there?" And he says, "They're celebrating my rights." Well, but what do they do? And Dionysius says, "Well, would you like to know? Would you like to see?" And Pentheus says, "Well, yes, of course I'd love to see. Can we go see?" And he said, "Well, not dressed like that. They'll kill you if they see a man invade their sacred space in their ritual. But if you dress up as a woman, then you can sneak in there." And so this really masculine warrior has Dionysius dress him in a wig and he's actually it's very in a way it's funny even though it's a tragedy because Euripides has him saying, "Does this look good? You know, do I look fat?" I mean, he this female side kind of comes out of this manly king. And then the tragedy is completed when Pentheus goes and he spies on the women, and then Dionysius allows him to be seen and caught. And his own mother rips him apart thinking he's an animal in her frenzy and thinking that they've been attacked by an animal, which is a statement about how she feels about this man who dressed up as a woman to invade the rights of the women, even if it's his own her own son. So of course, this is a terrible tragedy for her as when she comes to her senses. And Euripides tells us, now see, this is why we must respect Dionysius. In a way, it's like saying we must respect the irrational. We must respect our drive for ecstasy, our drive for experiencing material joys. Because if we don't, it drives us crazy.
Exactly, exactly. So when he arrives in the town, he introduced himself. I already conquered and earned the the adoration and respect and veneration from all old world like Arabia, Phoenicia, Phrygia, even India. So they
Exactly.
already know me. So I came here to introduce myself because you have forgotten me. So that was the
Exactly. Yes.
introduction. That was
Is
very telling. And regarding this, actually, you just mentioned that our emotion and our like passion, that part we cannot just ignore by being a manly man like Pantheon.
exactly.
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 Our
And
emotion.
so now this religion was
Mhm.
somewhat frightening to the Greeks because it involved in some of the cult you would rip apart an animal. That was the sacrifice, and you literally had to rip a living animal apart and they would eat the raw flesh sometimes. There was bull slaughters, and they would bathe in the blood. And so this was to the Greeks who were talking about Zeus and the law of hospitality. They were a little set back by what is going on here among the rural people. Women had a lot of power because of the Maenads. The Maenads were normal Greek women, but they were driven mad by Dionysius and they would wander in the hills, and men were afraid of them because they were a dangerous opponent. They were said to have killed Orpheus. And so what happens is very interesting because, of course, Dionysius is constantly reinvented, right? The Romans make him into Alexander. They say that he went to India and conquered India, and he gave India laws. And I mean, it's clearly they're mythologizing Alexander and putting him on top of this Dionysian mythology, but probably because of the Pythagoreans, although academics are still arguing about this, and there are good points for and against. But it makes a lot of sense that Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans had this idea, which was, can we take the Dionysian religion and transform it into a civilizing force? How do you do this? It seems impossible. I mean, how would you take such a bloody, wild, all music and people are getting drunk and they always show him, with Priapus, right, walking around with a huge erection,
Mhm.
and it was just really kind of against the Greek concept of how you should behave as a warrior and how people comport themselves within the city state. So, how do you turn this into a force for civilization? This is the myth of Orpheus now. So, Orpheus also appears pretty early. Around the same time that we see signs of Dionysius, we see Orpheus. And this has led people like Madame Blavatsky, for example, to suggest that Orpheus was indeed Hindu. And she even said she thought that his name came from a Greek word for river mud because he had dark skin. I don't know if that's really true. There's a lot of potential name origins for him, and there are many Orpheuses, by the way. The myth is a conglomerate of them. But in its essence, the story goes like this: that somebody came along, Orpheus, who he naturally had this power of music, where being the son of a muse, they would say, he could move even the gods with his music, and he could educate. And when he was on the Argos, the first boat that went around for the Greeks, and they said they left temples everywhere. Well, he wrote the liturgies for these temples. He was said to learn what people worshipped in the area, and then he would build an altar and he would write songs for them, and this would become the liturgy of a new religion. And he was said to be so wonderful with his music, for example, that the sirens were silenced by him. And so the sailors were not drawn to their destruction when the sirens sang. And he writes supposedly this set of hymns. He's gathering all the gods together because, in a way, they are all considered very separate at this time. Some gods are in more than one city, but most gods specialize in one city. And so all of a sudden he gathers them all together as the Greek gods. And they're all part of one family, the Olympian family. And we sing hymns to them. And Homer, of course, did the same thing with the Iliad and the Odyssey and with the Homeric hymns, gathering up gods from all the different cities and the rural areas and making them into one kind of bureaucracy of gods that could be a more civilized approach to worship. So Orpheus institutes some big rule changes. First, Orpheus says that we do not kill for sacrifice. We don't eat meat at all because we believe in reincarnation. And we believe that if reincarnation is true and you kill an animal, you might be killing someone who is dear to you, even your own mother, something that you still hear in Buddhism.
Mhm.
And so now we're not eating meat and we're not sacrificing animals. We're going to use milk and flowers and honey. Those are the gifts we give to the gods. He even said, what gods would be pleased by such a thing, by the slaughter of animals? I mean, it's ridiculous. He said, they want us, you really want to please the gods? Live a pure life. Find your soul and live a soulful life. Well, this was the opposite of Olympian religion, where in Olympian religion, the goal for the man was to be a warrior. That was the best way to die, was in war. And Achilles and Odysseus, these war heroes, were the great heroes.
Mhm.
Theseus, right, going to Minos and slaying the Minotaur. It was all feats of arms and warfare.
Hercules,
Yes.
another Hercules. Mhm.
Exactly. And so now you get the idea that no, actually, these warriors are fools because they have fallen into the titanic nature of human beings. And what that means is there was a myth under all this. And the myth was that when Dionysius was born, his first given name was Zagreus. And
Mhm.
Zeus adored him and wanted to make him the next king of the gods, even gave him the thunderbolts, let him sit on the divine throne. Some people say that Hera was angry about this because it wasn't her child and she was Zeus's wife. But others say that it was just the Titans themselves, that they didn't need Hera to anger them. They were angry to see Zeus so happy and about to create another god that was going to keep them away from their inheritance. They considered themselves the original gods. And so they expressed their anger by waiting for the right opportune moment and luring Dionysius, Zagreus, off of this throne, and they take him somewhere where Zeus is not looking, and they slaughter him and they cook him and they eat him, hoping that they will have in them his power, that they will now have Zeus's power. Well, Zeus figures it out. It's too late, but he sees what's happening, and so he throws lightning and he burns the whole horrible scene. And from those ashes, humanity is born. So we are part Titan, and we hate the gods because of that. And we are angry and vengeful and afraid, and we don't trust nature, and we want our way above all. but we are also children of Dionysius, actually pieces of Dionysius. We're Dionysius's own flesh and soul. And all that's left is the heart, which Zeus was said to have taken and sewn into his thigh as a second womb. And then from there, Dionysius is born. They called him the twice born. And this myth is the origin of humanity, according to the Orphics. So we're all struggling against our titanic nature, and we live life after life on what they call the weary wheel of grief, very similar to the Hindu concept. And they believed that you would never remember, right? That who you really were. You would just go from one incarnation to the next as a titan, getting in fights, fighting wars, thinking that you're succeeding, dying of old age, and over again until someday you were able to wake up within yourself that Dionysian part of you. And so when you do that, you are on that journey to reclaiming your soul. And the Orphics taught that when you die, they had a password that they would give you, a death passport. And what you were to say to the guardians was that you are a child, I'm a child of earth and of starry heaven, but my race is heaven. This you know. Now give me cold water to drink from the fountain of memory. And when you drank from that water instead of from the river of Lethe that everybody else was drinking from and forgetting everything, when you drank from that fountain of memory, you remembered all your lives. And you remembered most of all that you are actually an eternal divine being. And as a divine being, you have the right to go be at the feast of the gods and to join the gods in the higher level of existence that they partake in. So this was the Orphic myth. And this meant that if you were a warrior, if you were out there, the hero of your city, to an Orphic, you were sad. You were a sad case because you were going to be reincarnated over and over again because you had no clue what you were doing. You were killing. That's the worst thing you could do. This is a radical philosophy, and I think just from describing it, you can see how influential it was on Christianity, right? Because Christianity comes later.
And it's totally like if you read Greek philosophy and the Dionysian mythology, you
Hmm.
can see the later writer definitely tried to reconcile and incorporate these two through Dionysus and through Zeus. Because in
Yes.
their Olympias gods,
Hmm.
they have a complete sets like first generation of God, second generation, third
Yes.
generation. In third generation, Zeus is the ruler, like
Yes.
acting ruler. The Titans are all banished. They're not dead, but they're in the background.
In
But
Tartarus, yeah.
exactly. But in this line chain of gods, there's
Hmm.
no Dionysus. But
Right.
later we realize the Dionysus is blended, and like some ancient authors, they're trying to say the Eros, like before Uranus,
Hmm.
before Zeus was born, or Phanes from in Orpheus. So that
Yes.
was the Dionysius soul. So from
Yes.
Zeus came, so he tried to reestablish his ancestor through Dionysus. So the
Hmm.
myth is very powerful, and that
Yes.
soul is shared by humanity because we came from heaven. So that I
Exactly.
believe exactly.
Yeah.
So later writer like made a very nice blend through the Orpheus or Pythagorean Hindu reincarnation, metempsychosis, all these things. So it's
Hmm.
a comprehensive, very nice story.
Yes.
Problem is most of the people they just read Dionysus is the Bacchus or the crazy part, but they don't realize the life force doesn't
Exactly.
follow rationality. It has its own rule. Either you comply or get destroyed. There's no
Yes.
compromise in between. Exactly.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that was that was a really interesting turn of events. But you
Well,
just mentioned,
I
yeah,
was just gonna say he's been called the indestructibility of life.
exactly. Exactly. Like I think the root word was Zo, like Zoe, like
Hmm.
still there's a name Zoe, right?
You know your stuff.
In,
You know
in
this stuff
yeah, exactly. Friends.
very well.
Yeah, exactly. And that persona is very irrational. He is all about women, sex. It's very. I don't know if the name was intentional or not in the TV series Friends, Zoe,
Yeah,
but that matches very nicely.
it does. Yeah.
Exactly. You just mentioned that even that like not so common myth is very foundational for Christianity. So why not
Yes.
you elaborate on that?
Okay. Well, you mentioned Greek philosophy and the influence of that myth on Plato, and then through Plato on the Neoplatonists is massive. There are Neoplatonists in the ancient world who argued, for instance, Olympiodorus, that Pluto was sorry, that Plato was Orphic, that he was even though he insults Orpheus in his dialogues as a coward, that in reality his philosophy was saturated with Orphic concepts. And so this is also the opinion that most of the Neoplatonists held. And it's interesting that in academia, at first, this was understood. Like in Christianity, they were reading these materials, the early church fathers, and were even some of them were arguing, you know what, this Orphic stuff is pre-Christian Christianity. This is good. We can learn and take things from this. But then we get into an academia, at least by 1900, maybe a little earlier, where they're like the Neoplatonists are considered to be mystics and just ridiculous. They didn't understand Plato at all. And in fact, Plato himself was dismissed to a degree because they wanted to look at him as a sociologist, as a mathematician, as a political theorist, and they wanted to forget that, for instance, he said that the ruler of his perfect city should be a council of Orphic priests. And so they said, well, he must have been senile when he wrote that. They actually argued that. More recently, as academia has discovered respect for esotericism and for wanting to preserve these ideas and understand them, we are seeing a return to this idea that the Neoplatonists had a deep understanding of what was really being said in Plato, and that the Orphic influence was profound. Now, through that, through Plato, and through some of the early surviving Neoplatonic stuff that was influencing, there were a few early church fathers who kind of came out of Neoplatonism and become Christians, but they're still influenced by Plotinus and Proclus and by not so much Iamblichus. He falls to the side because he's so into magic and theurgy, the art of becoming a one with the gods, that the Christians find him a little too pagan. But Plotinus is incredibly beautiful, mystical ideas about the world. For instance, his statement, everything breathes together. And then, of course, Proclus's complex analysis of the psychology of being and the ontology of it appealed to some of the early church fathers. And they adapted some of these ideas and these very Orphic concepts to such a degree that you see sometimes an overlap. For instance, in the catacombs, you can see
Mhm.
Orpheus and Jesus both being invoked. And you can see Jesus overtaking Orpheus's good shepherd imagery. Because in the pagan world, Orpheus was almost always shown surrounded by animals that were listening to him sing. And so this was interpreted by the Christians as, well, Jesus, is also attracting the animals because the lion sleeps with the lamb when Jesus's energy is there, when Jesus is present. And so this is kind of an Orphic gift of harmonizing without the music. Also, that one should be nonviolent and that killing is not noble and that sacrifice is wrong and that we're trying to recover our true souls and we forget ourselves and lose ourselves. All of these ideas wind up in Christianity, and not only from the Orphic influence, from other influences as well. But Orphism is a strong influence on that, because you can't really find too much in the ancient world that so closely resembles Christianity in its denial of um, get the most you can out of life and all those philosophies.
And this particular connection between Orphism, Dionysus, and Christianity is very conveniently omitted.
Yeah,
Everybody is silent because the correlation is so strong. For example, not many gods born twice.
Right? Exactly.
That is one.
Yeah.
And not many god has a pre-existence before bodily presence,
Yep.
because all the Dionysus is pre-existent before his body came. He was before there.
Yes.
Another one correlation is, I think early first century, second century in Christianity, there was a scandal that Christians are like they're cannibals. They're eating flesh of other Christians because that's the.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
Dionysus was killed and eaten by Titan,
Exactly. Yes.
plus the
The mo-
bread, wine in the Last
that's
Supper.
that's what I was going to say.
Exactly.
And the wine, above all the wine, right? That the sacredness of the vine. And also let's not forget that there's this um how do you put it? There's a sense that the existing political military order is wrong
Exactly.
and must be challenged. So there's a revolutionary quality in these
Exactly.
religions. Also in early Christianity, women had a strong presence.
Exactly.
And this was also true
India.
in right. So yeah, it's pretty amazing when you look at it how many similarities there are.
And another one, geopolitical, I would say, the Roman plebeius revolt
Yes,
before the actual like end of kingship and rebirth of a senate, like
yes,
transitional time, like 400 BC.
yeah,
At that time, the plebeius, their high god was Liber Pater, and that's
that's
that.
right.
So those are like village people, heathen, versus the more city people, like more
Yes,
Olympian type, like Jupiter. So
yes,
Jupiter versus Liber Pater or Dionysus. That's the fight.
yes,
The same
yes,
thing is happening today, like celebrity versus common people like us.
yes,
Not you,
yeah,
you are celebrity. I'm talking
yeah,
about myself. Like
yeah,
the tension between these two. There is a, like I would say, super perennialism versus emergence of civilization. So
yes.
the conflict between these two, like, can be studied inside Dionysus myth itself.
Absolutely. And
Exactly.
then you can also carry it into another direction, which is there's a fascinating book written by Arthur Evans called The God of Ecstasy. He also includes his new translation of the Bacchae. And in it, he suggests that the whole European witchcraft tradition that was demonized by the church was really the Dionysian religion
Exactly.
and that it survived for centuries in these small rural groups who wanted to keep alive this pagan celebration of fertility and the earth and of the vine. And if just really when we combine, because one of the things that's so important to all of this, when we were saying it's rural, so we tend when we say rural to think, oh well, it's country, it's not so sophisticated. But to me, it's very poetic because what they're looking at when they're looking at fertility cult, they're looking at the fact that if you've ever had grapevines, you know that
Exactly.
they in winter they die out and you cut them back and it looks like death and then they suddenly grow in spring and they spring up amazingly and they wrap up around everything and then they produce these delicious fruits that intoxicate when you ferment them and make people happy when they're sad and make them have mystical experiences even. And
Literally liberated, because
yes,
wine makes you liberated.
yes,
Exactly.
exactly. And then you've also got the celebration of human sexuality, the fertility that is the image of the thyrsos, right? The fennel stalk with the pine cone on top of it. And so you're celebrating that too, because that is the same fertility that you see in the grapevine. It's that
It-
ability to rise and to give life and to this precious fluid of life, whether it's wine or it's human reproduction. And
and
that's profound.
exactly the same thing. Actually, those dried up, dead, apparently grapevine collect the raindrops that comes from the heaven, and that collected in the grape, and that becomes the life force through the sex, because wine also stimulates ecstasy
That's
and
right.
So
Yeah,
it's all connected. It's
it
liberating.
is.
It's like emotional, not logical, and it stimulates growth and reproduction and happiness. Like perfect,
Exactly.
perfect symbolism.
Yes, it
I don't
really
see
is.
any symbolism uh, in Dionysus than any other myth. That's why I'm fascinated. And you are the expert because you translated a couple of original Orphic hymns, I believe, right? Recently.
Well, I'm certainly not the expert. I know a few people that I would recommend above me, but I have studied it for a long time and have read just about everything I can get my hands on, because I am very fascinated with it. And we should definitely mention the work of Alain Danielou, who he's a very controversial figure. He certainly had racist tendencies, and he found in the caste system support for his bigotry. But at the same time, he was a profound scholar. And he has a book, I think, called The Gods of Ecstasy, that is about how he thinks that Shiv is the origin of Dionysius. And he shows you all these similarities, that here is this god that didn't fit in with the other gods, and here is a god that where intoxication was okay for Shiv, but it's not okay for others. And just in the way sexuality was a constant theme with Shiv, and how he was associated with rural and wilderness areas and with madness. And so it's very possible that this is a translation of Hindu ideas into ancient Greece at a very early period.
Exactly, exactly. And Dionysus claims that he came from east. So, and I think you mentioned Alexander the Great. When
Yes.
he went to Bactria and when he tried to conquer and kill the kings, they
Yeah.
say, "Hey, we worship the same God. Don't you worship Dionysus? Dionysus is our God too." So then he like stopped the war and he married a couple of women over there.
Yes. Yeah.
Because when spirituality, most of the time people conquer other people because they're not us, they're different from us, they
Hmm.
pray different to God. But when you can show actually we worship the same God, you become friends. So
Hmm.
that was sudden, I don't know, change in heart in like Alexander the Great, that why he did not do too much damage in India when he realized actually he, as a person, he is also very Dionysian because he drinks a lot and he
Yes.
realizes a lot and
Yes.
he has the esoteric teaching of those Orphic mystery before he came, right? His
Yeah.
father is thieves.
And he's
Not
going
from, not from um, not from Greece proper. He is close
right.
from like Theban, like Macedonia,
Yes.
close to Theban,
Yes.
exactly. Like
And
Persian,
he's he, and
Persian
he's
is there,
right. And he's going around the world conquering. There's just
exactly.
something that the other Greek gods are not really
No,
doing.
yeah, they don't go outside, exactly.
Yeah.
And now I think we covered just the basic mythology part, that even though
Hmm.
it appears is just another myth, but if you connect all them together,
Hmm.
it's very powerful and a central myth that
Agreed.
covers both East and the Greece proper together. So
Yes.
now let's talk about some specific aspects. For example, you covered say, Christianity connection and its influence of Dionysus in the future development of religions. I have a couple of questions. For example, you mentioned Plato.
Yes.
So in the mythology, like in a separate set of mythology, was a person. I think his name was Selenius, something
Yeah.
Selenius.
Hmm.
So he was tutor and the nurturer of infant or younger Dionysus. And he
Hmm.
was a chubby guy, like big stomach, always
Hmm.
drinks, and
Hmm.
always associated with other like goats. So he
Hmm.
was a perfect analogy of Socrates. And
Yes, that's
that
true.
Platonic philosophy is based on Socrates' mouthpiece, right? And
Hmm.
also during the symposium, they all drink wine and they are talking about all kinds of things. And at the end, Socrates says, the highest person I have ever respect was the like Eros or something like that.
Hmm.
And that Eros is actually Dionysian.
Hmm.
So even though Plato himself a good poet, he hates poetry. But at the
Yes.
end, he represents this tradition rather than fighting. So let's talk about some symbolisms. Like, what are the classic symbolisms of Dionysus? You mentioned pine cone, and you also
Hmm.
mentioned wine. I think we covered wine. You also
Yes.
mentioned briefly about the animals. So let's talk
Yes.
about animals and also
Sure.
pine cone. So
Well, we
let's
have
elaborate.
the bull is usually
Oh,
associated and as a symbol of the most tremendous fertility and strength and yet it is aggressive animal, but it is an animal that is aggressive in defense and is not a predator. But on the predator side, you have the panther, and the panther was sacred. And like Durga, you see Dionysius being portrayed as riding on a panther very often. And so this symbolism of the cat, some people have thought points back to Egypt. And this is an interesting thing because when you look back in Egypt and you look for something that resembles this, you find it, but not in the way you would expect to, which is you find it in a female goddess. And that is the lioness-headed goddess Sekhmet. She is also a goddess of intoxication, and her festival was supposedly, Herodotus says that 300,000 people showed up in Egypt to celebrate her festival. And it was all about music and intoxication and what happens when those two things are together. And she was also called the Invincible One, and she was the one who guarded the life force, the balance of nature, ma'at, that is required for life to exist and to continue. And she is the invincible guardian of that. She's even called the one before whom all other gods tremble. And in a way, he's like that too, because
exactly.
he's
That's
he's
everything you just mentioned. If you did not mention Sekhmet and Egypt, it goes to Dionysus directly. What?
exactly. Yeah,
Exactly.
isn't that amazing? So you see there seems to be a thread there that got pulled forward. And the Egyptians, I mean, the funny thing about Greece is that American, English, French, German, I mean, basically European scholars spent generations trying to make Greece the origin of the West. And the Greeks themselves always said, well, we got it from Egypt. We got it from the Phoenicians. We got it from India. You know, they were very open about it. And
Exactly.
and yet we had to create this false mythology that these were all original concepts that we had created. I'm pretty sure that even the mystery schools were Egyptian influenced. Plato said that he studied in Egypt. Pythagoras was said to have gone and studied in Egypt. Orpheus was said to have gone and studied in Egypt. Now, I also want to point out something else since we're talking about gender, an interesting evolution, which is that, and this also goes back to similarities of Christianity, which is that Dionysius goes into hell and saves both his wife and his mother. And he brings them out safely and takes them to be divine and live with the gods. He's the only, Jesus went into hell to save the souls. And here you have this example. And by the way, there's something kind of micro in there, which is that his wife, Ariadne, is somebody who starts out as the love interest of a great warrior, Theseus, this what maybe the primal Greek warrior symbol next to
Mhm.
Hercules. And she helps him to defeat her own father and to get through the labyrinth and to kill the Minotaur. But then he just dumps her. He's like a classic patriarchal hero. Thanks for the help. I'm taking all this stuff, and I'll see you later. And he just leaves her on an island, and
Mhm.
she wants to commit suicide. In some version, she even does it. But along comes Dionysius, and he falls in love with her. He thinks she's the most wonderful soul he's ever encountered, and so he goes back, and he takes her out of hell, and he makes her his wife, and then takes her up to be divine. Same thing for his mother, who was a mortal woman. Famously, the story goes that um, Hera was very jealous that Zeus was smitten with Ariadne's mother, Semele, So she said, hey, why don't you ask Zeus to show full glory? Because that's what he does with Hera, I mean, if he really loves you, he should. Now, she knew what would happen. And Zeus tells her, don't ask for this because you will not survive seeing me in my glory. You're just a mortal. But she says, you said you would do anything I ask, and this is what I ask. So he reveals his glory. She's killed. But along comes her son, Dionysius, and he takes her out of hell. Whatever Hera thinks, forget it. I'm the son of Zeus, and I'm taking her up into heaven, and she's going to be with the gods. And so this rescuing function is something we see with Jesus. But now here's the interesting point. Orpheus tries to do the same thing. When his wife Eurydice dies, he tries to go into hell to redeem her. And we have the tragic story of the backward glance. He does not accomplish what Dionysius accomplished. And it partially because he can't overcome his impatience. He's told, do not look at her, don't turn back and look. But you keep going, and if she goes out into the sunlight without you looking at her, she'll be back in the world of the living and you can be with her, but he can't stand it and he looks back too soon and he loses her forever. So this is this very ironic change. And now another interesting thing about that is, so what does he do? He's brokenhearted. So now every morning he sings to the sun when it comes up. He's singing to Apollo. So he has abandoned, in a way, Dionysius and the Maenads and this whole culture. And now he's talking to Apollo, and Apollo is teaching him the mysteries of the gods, they said. Now, this isn't necessarily a conflict because Apollo is said to save Dionysius, that we are saved by Apollo. And the Neoplatonists said that Apollo's name literally means not many. And that's because his job is to gather all of us broken pieces, or sometimes called the tears of Dionysius, and gather us all back together to restore the full glory of the body of Dionysius. But it's still a shift because now Dionysius is no longer at the center of the religion. Now it's Apollo who's at the center of the religion. I really think that this is Pythagorean. I mean,
Like
especially.
later modification or blending, I would say
Mhm.
syncretism.
Yes, exactly. And
Oh,
there's an earlier tradition that they adapt, and it's interesting too because, it used to be thought that the Orphics were a great church, really, that there were Orphic temples, and European scholars used to write about this, and they claimed, for example, to have found a image of a figure hanging on a cross, and it said Orphoi, a Bakoi on it. And it
mhm.
was destroyed during World War II, unfortunately, the museum that it was in, and it was lost. So that they don't know if it was a forgery or not because they didn't have the tests at the time. But this was held up as look, I mean, talk about influence on Christianity. Here is Orpheus hanging on a cross. And the theory was that during the Orphic initiation, you would be hung on a cross that spins.
Mhm,
And this
mhm,
was to give you you were told while it was happening, basically, this is your soul having forgotten itself, whirling lost through space. And then they would let you go, and you would go, you couldn't stay up because your balance was all wrecked, and you'd probably fall over. And they would say, that's what your soul is like because you've forgotten what you are. Probably, I mean, we have no evidence of any of this really outside the imaginations of the authors. But it's interesting to see how this attempt was made to construct. They said that it was 600 years of Orphic church.
mhm,
But now we think that it was more like a literary movement. There were Orphic priests that were more like street priests who would go city to city looking for rich people who had either just died or who were sick. And they would come to the door and offer to do these purification rituals to guarantee a transition into the after death state that would preserve consciousness. And they had all these books that were supposedly by Orpheus, but were by all sorts of people. And they were all signed as Orpheus, and they would sell them. And they were not unlike the Egyptian books of the dead. They were intended to be read for the dead person's edification so that they would be have a guidance in the afterworld. But the thought was that the hymns and some of these other Orphic materials were actually the creation of these sort of intellectual symposiums, as you mentioned, very similar to what Plato describes, where people got together, they drank, and for
Mm,
example, modern scholars have pointed out that the Orphic hymns seem to be in an order that really fits it because it builds up, and in the middle, the hymns are really getting into intoxication and kind of sexual, even resonances. But then as it begins to close, it goes into topics like sleep and death. It closes with death. It's like
mm,
wake up, sober up. We're done with the symposium,
mm,
and and it's also interesting, by the way, that the way that they talk to death, because they don't say some religions will beg death, come later, give me a reprieve, don't take my loved one. They don't do that. They say death is you can't bargain with death, but we can thank death. And what we're thanking death for is first for increasing our appreciation of life and of who and what we love. Because
mm,
when we lose someone, when we realize impermanence, which we're always trying to forget,
mm,
we suddenly realize how precious these people and things and pets and just what the things that we love are to us, and in that world of impermanence, that we pour love out on it because we are feeling this grief. But the other thing that death gives us is liberation. Death gives us this chance to remember, right? To remember who we are and what we are.
exactly. I think in the topics you just mentioned runs in parallel with Eleusinian mystery school. That was
Hmm.
pretty much Orphic, and
Hmm.
whenever the Orphic stuff comes, is based on directly or indirectly Dionysian myth.
Yes.
At the
Yes.
end, I think after the initial ecstasy and dancing and everything, so at
Hmm.
the end, there was something related to death and how to overcome death. The thing you just mentioned, how to be thankful for the death. I think the mystery was revealed only to the initiate because it was a private school, and
Yeah.
that's why we know so little about it. But
Yeah.
somehow those ideas are borrowed in the subsequent religion, including Christianity, right?
Yes. Well, it's funny because Manly Hall, um, aside from working with him, he was a great friend, and he really he adored my wife, and he obviously liked me, gave me incredible opportunities, and sometimes we would just hang out at their house, he and his wife Marie. And that had some amazing moments because, for example, at one time they were just watching television and changing channel to channel, and MTV came on in the 1980s. So, this was really MTV. And he left it on for a minute. And Tamara and I, my wife, were looking at each other like, oh, wow, like, what's he going to say? And what he said was, what a pity it was, because they were resurrecting all the technology of the mysteries, the lights, the music, the words, the fog, and they were waking the psychic centers of the audience, but they weren't teaching them anything.
Exactly, it's just entertainment part.
Yeah.
At the end, the typically everybody went there not for drinking, I believe, because
Mm-mm.
even people at the time, their time had value because entry was difficult. You have to pay or you have to do something, and or
Hmm.
you have to prove yourself to be worthy to be initiated, right?
Hmm.
And then So everybody went there for either to gain something or to get immortality or some get some clue, something. So at the end, priests definitely did something to them. They changed their life. That's how the tradition continued for hundreds of
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. And we don't have a lot of witness accounts because they were sworn to secrecy, but we do have Plutarch talks about his experience of the mysteries, that he and his wife were able to deal with the grief of the death of one of their children because of what they learned in the mysteries, which was that the body is not the end, that we have souls that go on. And he
Yeah.
described one intriguing aspect. He said that part of the experience was like running through dark caverns, and you would panic because you really couldn't see where you were going, and people would fall and they would bruise themselves, and they would then see light in the distance and they would run toward that light, and then when they got there they would burst out onto a beautiful green field where musicians were playing, and where these beautiful words were being recited or sang. And these words were, the whole thing was meant to recreate the death experience, essentially. Another thing that they said was happening in the Orphic Mysteries, and we don't know if it's true or not, but it could be, was that the Orphic Mysteries is one of the first places where um, they had like the first caverns you would enter had paintings of all the suffering of human life, disease, corpses, war, natural dis. I mean, in those days, unless it happened to your village or you were
Mhm.
traveling, it's not like today when you turn on the feed and you see every disaster from every corner of the world. I mean, you didn't normally see all of these things in one place, impinging on you the sense of impermanence and of suffering. And then you were told to wear, I think it's called a thronodos, which is a death shroud, and you'd sit on a stool in a death shroud in a dark place after you saw all these things, so that you could sit and really feel fear and insecurity and how you really don't know where any of your life is going, or where this experience is going. Because in some
Mhm.
of the mysteries, I do know there were reports that there was fear that maybe you would be killed or something, that they didn't really know what was going to happen depending on how the mysteries were conducted. And the Orphic ones were more peaceful and because they didn't have that violent component. But there were other mysteries that were told about, like the Samothracian, that had more of a warrior element, and where there could be this kind of challenge by the guardians, right? By armed people who would challenge you to respond correctly. And so uh, this it's almost like
Excuse me.
no problem. It's almost like spirituality by theater, and
Yeah,
it's so
real life enactment of ritual,
yes,
but
yes,
as if it's a theater. But if you don't know if a theater, the initiate, those who are not initiated, they might get frightened. I might get killed because nobody told me
exactly,
it was a fake.
exactly, yeah,
Exactly. It was real to them. And
yes,
that's how it is life changing. Because if you watch
yes,
something and you know it is fake at the beginning, you don't connect, right? But if you
yeah,
participate without knowing if it is just a ritual or it's a real deal,
that's
then
right.
you go through the process, you get frightened. At the end, you get a near death experience. But after that, you see greenery. You just mentioned it's like life after life, right? So,
Yes,
permanent.
precisely. And in some forms of the mystery, I mean, there's arguments about this. They say that in some of the mysteries, like the Eleusinian, that there was some sort of a drink that was taken that may have had hallucinogenic properties. They talk about ergo or mushrooms have been proposed, but and in fact, an interesting thing, I've been working on a paper with a colleague about. Robert Graves correctly pointed out a strange thing about Orpheus, which is that he is always portrayed with a lyre. But in those days, you had to string with animal gut. So it didn't make a lot of sense that Orpheus, who prohibits killing animals for the gods would make his sacred songs on animal guts.
Mhm, mhm,
The suggestion from Graves was that this might be because what he really used was a flute, and flutes
mhm.
were used very much in early Greek religion. So my colleague, he went and he researched the reeds in the area that were made into flutes, and he found that there's this giant reed that is especially connected to mystery schools and was cultivated very often next to mystery schools. And the biggest shock was that that reed has precursors of DMT in it.
Oh,
So if you grow it at different times, like there were strict rules about when to harvest for which ritual. And his idea is that this was because they had learned when it was potent in certain ways. And so you would, for this ritual, you would want this potency. For that ritual, you would want a different potency. But that the musician, or anyone who was using this flute was imbibing DMT essentially.
mhm, mhm.
So
Yeah,
that's a
even though
possibility.
even though there like literature suggests there must be some drink, either alcoholic, non-alcoholic, mushroom, or DMT, but my gut feeling says those are merely as a like to create the right environment, not
Yes,
necessarily the actual like tool that creates a nice environment so that they are more suggestive, they are more
absolutely.
perceptive. But at the end it's the whole ritual or initiation process itself rather than the drug effect.
Absolutely. Yes, because
Exactly.
that's the primary mistake that was made. In the 60s, Timothy Leary and a lot of people thought that
They're
if
all
you
about drugs. Drug doesn't do anything. For
it
example,
doesn't,
otherwise it
it amplifies
San
yeah, what's
Francisco will be all initiated and liberated, right? In San
that's
Francisco.
right, exactly. And I always tell people, for instance, shrooms, which some people think are this amazing, cure-all for human dysfunction, that the guy who invented 4chan, I believe it was, maybe it was 8chan, I'm not sure, but he did it on shrooms. I mean, a lot of bad things have been invented while people were high. It doesn't mean you're only going to have good ideas. You're going to have, I mean, Charlie Manson was high, you have ideas that reflect who you are. Now, in a
Yeah.
controlled environment, where the mystery school is showing you these symbols and putting you through these symbolic experiences, it helps to get rid of the inhibitions, open up the mind and the heart, make you more susceptible to as being a hypnotic influence, especially if it has ecstatic connotations to it. It's going to make you more receptive to the experience that you're having.
Suppose the ritual or rite, the participant might feel there might not be real. There may be pretending as a part of the ritual, but you are under the influence. You might
Yeah.
perceive it as real, like
Yeah.
somebody comes with a sword. But if
Yes.
you know that I came with a party, they are not going to kill me. But if you are under the influence, that sword makes you fear that is real.
That's
So
right.
yeah, those drugs might be a contributing towards the
Yeah.
induction, I would say, like more suggestiveness, or to perceive things as real rather than just a fake
Yes. I mean,
ceremony.
to your point, we go back now to Sekhmet and these festivals. They knew what they were doing too, because they would have these all-night festivals. By the morning, people were mostly passed out, and they would wheel in the statue of Sekhmet, which was made out of this glittering granite. And just as the sun came up and it lit up the statue, they would pound these huge kettle drums and wake everybody up. And people would hallucinate that this goddess was talking, the statue was talking to them, or was moving, or her eyes looked at them, or all these things happened as they were waking up out of this unconscious state. And they would be moved to these deep prayers and asking the goddess for help and healing and such. So the Egyptians were already playing around with that technology.
Mhm. And about the feminine part that you correlate with segment, that correlates very nicely with Dionysian traits and the rites.
Hmm.
Dionysus himself was little bit effeminate, right? He
Hmm.
has large breast, young guy, beautiful look. So many people say he was the original hermaphrodite, like
It's true.
pre-cut.
There's two different ones, It's the Greeks also portrayed him as a bearded, big,
Bearded, yeah.
strong man, Zeus's kid. But
Mhm.
but certainly the one that we see in Euripides, for example, is exactly as you describe, this androgyne, on the
Androgen.
feminine side.
Feminine side. So there's not many god who born twice who
Hmm.
has two aspects simultaneously, because most
Hmm.
of the mystery school are focused with duality, male femaleness,
Hmm.
androgyny. Very interested in to learn about mythology because and everybody, even Plato's I think symposium, they said back
Hmm.
in the old time men used to be two part, one part of
That's
male.
right. Yeah.
That's the hermaphrodite myth. So that even Phanes was typically depicted as a partial hermaphrodite, right?
Yes.
So Dionysus has that trait, not Zeus, not
Yes.
any
And,
other
and,
big.
and here's something interesting too, that back to Sekhmet for a moment. She's a
Mhm.
female lioness, but her statues all give her the neck ruff, just a little bit of an adolescent male lion. So
Wow.
she's also this gender blend.
And behind you, I can see there are some cats.
Yes, I also have them in the house. There's none in the room right now though.
Okay.
These are past cats who I keep at my shoulder.
Okay. Yeah, I think Sekhmet is typically also associated with cats itself, not necessarily lioness, right? Not necessarily.
Yes, she can be associated. Well, her sister goddess Bast, who was originally a lioness goddess, but then became famous as that black cat statue.
Mhm.
Usually, Sekhmet is depicted with a lion's head or as a lioness, but she too also has it. There's a famous old story passed down amongst pagans who are into cats and who know about Egypt that the story goes that I think personally that this was a piece of sophisticated and humorous literature by a period of the Egyptians that was pretty sophisticated and not very purely religious. But the story was that Ra got old and that the human race didn't respect him anymore. And they began to be cheaters and liars and murderers. And he got disgusted with it and he wanted to punish humanity. And so he had his daughter Hathor, who was a love goddess and a beauty goddess and a fertility goddess. She was to go down there in a form of a lioness, and she was to start killing the unjust humans. Well, she started doing it, and what awakened from her as she did it was Sekhmet. She transformed into this primal goddess of justice. And the problem with that was that no human being was good enough. We were all not so good. So
Yeah.
she was going to kill everybody. And Ra decided, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I didn't want to kill everybody. And so they say Toth had the idea, let's put wine out there. She's sleeping it off right now. Let's pour a whole bunch of wine or red beer, and she'll
Mhm.
think it's blood when she wakes up. She'll be thirsty, and she'll drink this, and then she'll get inebriated, and she'll be okay. So this is what happens. The morning sun comes up, she sees all this, and she starts drinking it, and then she gets inebriated, and she's happy, and she forgets all about killing human beings. And so, but the funny part about that story is what pagans did with it. They said that, well, when she figured out what had been done to her, she was very angry because she said Ra had taken advantage of her. First, he forced her to act out his rage. He could have done it, but he
Mhm.
made her do it, which was that right there was wrong. And then he got her drunk without her even knowing that she was getting drunk to stop her from doing that. So she announces, I'm done with you gods. But I'll tell you this, I will be remembered and worshiped long after all you gods are forgotten. And the other god said, well, how is that going to happen? And she said, I'm turning myself into all domestic cats.
Everybody was with that.
Every little cat is a Sekhmet. according to
Oh,
this myth.
that's an interesting take. I never heard. Uh, yeah, in recent Olympic
Mhm.
in France, I believe, people are criticizing that why they are putting a weird person at the center of the. When I recognize, oh, he's Dionysus.
Yes, yeah,
Then I realized, no, 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 they're not stupid. French people, they're very cultured. They know what they're doing. But
exactly.
like from outsider, they seeing is like they're pushing this transgender idea.
Yeah.
They, but actually they're not pushing. It's just
No,
Dionysus.
it's an
He was
ancient god.
transgender
Yeah.
at the beginning. Yeah, he was
Yeah.
transgender at the very beginning, right? He used to
Yes.
wear the feminine clothes and
Yes.
everything. So in our contemporary life, especially in Hollywood,
Hmm.
especially music industry,
Yeah.
like Dionysus is very well alive. We don't
Oh,
like.
yes, I think so. And I think you also, I mean, you had some very overt examples, right? Like Jim Morrison, who was somebody who deeply got into Dionysius through Nietzsche. But
Mhm,
also, I was lucky to meet his, actually become friends with his pagan bride, Pamela Keneally Morrison, who was a Christian witch, she called herself. And she told me that he had studied the hymns of Orpheus as well, and that this was an influence on him. Greek theater, the hymns of Orpheus, the Greek mysteries were part of his the way he presented his songs in this sort of exaggerated,
mhm,
delivery that was filled with these intimations of important revelations, right? That he had picked this up from the Greeks and from reading about what they were doing. And I certainly think that this has been sometimes a very conscious effort, like on his part. I mean, he asked to have his hair cut to look like Alexander, right? So, I mean, he was deliberately manipulating aspects of Greek history and myth in his work. But I think it's also active, maybe let's call it in a Jungian sense, where you see that the androgynous quality, whether of the men or we have women who may be dressed very female, very sexually, but their behavior is quote unquote like men. They're aggressive, they're athletic, they're warriors, and this androgyny ultimately that was so embraced by Hollywood and by the music industry. I definitely think that it's still there, and I don't think it's the overt. You always hear about how there's these cults, and they're. I mean, I don't know. I've lived my whole life out here. I've been in the movie business. I've been in the music business. I never ran into any. I'm sure that there were some weird things going on. I've no doubt about it. But in terms of some big organized satanic or
mhm,
no. I mean, it's a bunch of greedy people who
mhm,
are all arguing with each other, making group decisions, often bad decisions. And I think that there's a level of paranoia that's attached to it. But I
mhm.
do think that there's definitely that archetype functioning through Hollywood. I mean, when you come here, it brings out of people. It's almost like Euripides. It's almost like the Bacchae, right? It's people
Exactly.
come to LA and they lose it.
And, like Pantheas, they want to know what they're up to.
Exactly.
Cannot,
Exactly.
cannot resist what they're doing. And somehow the problem is, like I have a lot of friends who are just regular professional, just normal people.
Hmm.
They have no idea that this kind of thing is not just the old tale in the past. They are living culture embedded inside in a
Yeah.
different brand name, right?
Yeah.
Different brand name. So if it is being practiced and adored and respected by the people that we respect, that then what is the real story? That is my motivation, because this is just a like as a regular person, why should I even bother those old or dead culture,
Right.
right? Actually,
Yeah.
they're not dead. They're not dead at all.
Not at all. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the like we already talked about influence on Christianity, influence of philosophy, including Neoplatonism, and
Hmm.
influence of in modern contemporary American culture.
Yeah.
So, one thing we did not mention about Abrahamic religion, like
Yeah.
Judaism and
Yeah.
Islam. because Christianity you already covered is very, there
Hmm.
are some correlate. Like in Bacchae, I think there was a uh, statement by Dionysus that
Hmm.
that you look like a man. That why should I consider you as a god? He says, it is not my bidding what I will appear. He chooses his own form. That means I can be whoever I want to be, or he is somebody who wants to. That is the quotation. I am who I am.
Hmm.
Identical, just translation Greek versus Old Testament. So I
Hmm.
am who I am is identical of what Dionysus is saying, that I can be in any
Hmm.
form, and that is
Hmm.
not my choice. It's
Hmm.
his choice. He's talking
Exactly.
about it as a third person, right? So
Yes.
that was one connection I saw. When I saw that sentence, it matches because I'm from like our tradition is more Abrahamic tradition, right?
Yes.
Bangladesh, India, those people, everybody by born is Abraham. You're Hindu.
Yeah.
You're Hindu. You understand what I'm saying.
Yes.
The second point I noticed that was interesting was this wine is also in Old Testament ritual. The high priest offered the wine, right? And the initiation of kings by the oil,
Hmm.
those libation, that's the libation. And the
Yeah.
libation culture is the Dionysian primary rite, right? Very primary rite.
Yes.
So even
Yes.
the Dionysius part is not like out of context in Abrahamic faith. And Herodotus,
No, no,
the
I
Her-
think it actually, think about, let's put it this way, it reappears consistently. So if you look at in the religion of Judaism and you look at David, right,
Mhm.
and that he's singing, and there are said to be mysteries contained within those songs. Is he singing to the woman he loves, or is this the soul singing to God? This is profoundly Orphic. It may predate it, and in fact, in the ancient world in Alexandria, during the times of the Roman Ptolemies ruling Egypt, they actually created a book called the Testament of Orpheus, which claimed that Orpheus studied with Moses because of the similarities that they saw in the teachings.
And
And
plus,
then,
there's magic involved in the Old Testament. There's some magic involved, ritual. They're very parallel. If you
yes,
and the life force itself, that
yeah.
part, the
And
God
then
is the.
then it returns later in
Mhm,
the medieval world in the troubadour tradition,
mhm.
where Sir Orfeo was a very popular character for the troubadours to sing about. And this lost love, this backward glance, was such a big part of the troubadour romantic love. That they would declare love to some queen that they would never hope to touch, but they would serve her and long for her. And and then I would also suggest that you see it in Islam, especially through Sufism,
Mhm,
where you
mhm.
see in Rumi, for example, somebody who is using the language of intoxication to talk about not actually being drunk, but about being drunk with God.
Exactly, exactly. And that was the purpose of Eleusinian mystery also. So it's the same, it's not different. The like core tenet remains the same somehow. So that's why it's
Mhm.
so powerful, so powerful. And
Yes.
one thing I wanted to mention,
Hmm.
Herodotus, because I learned this very recently after I contacted you. I recently read about it. Herodotus wrote in his history, it's like 400 BC, very
Hmm.
long time. At that time, in Arabia, there was no culture of written language. It's all oral. Plus,
Hmm.
they lived as a Bedouin, like very
Hmm.
rural, like this plebeian style. They don't have any king
Right.
because Arabian people did not have any king for a long time.
Yeah.
So they ruled themselves like a shepherd, and the shepherd is the
Yeah.
Hermes, Dionysus, that tradition.
Yeah.
Herodotus specifically wrote that Arabian people worship two gods. One was Orotalt, and scholar has translated that as a Allah, that Abrahamic
Hmm.
Islamic god. The other
Hmm.
one is Aphrodite, that was Allat, like the feminine part. So then I
Hmm.
feel, oh, this is not exotic even for Arabia. This is
Hmm.
well documented because Herodotus was very trustworthy. At least he writes something not just out of his mind. He has
Yeah. Yeah,
exactly.
he was trying to be accurate.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So when I realized this rain symbolism with the grapevine, and the rain is the mercy of God in
Mm.
Allah's like Islamic religion.
Yeah.
Another one thing, and that correlates very closely, the life force, always indestructible. Whatever you do, it remains. So
Hmm.
those are still like not irrelevant. So somehow, only one myth I see pervading everywhere, like consistent, is the Dionysian. But surprisingly, we know very little about as a normal educated person, unless you're a scholar, unless you study this subject. Normal people don't even come close to be aware that this
Yeah.
is a very fundamental myth of
Yeah.
human society, right?
Yeah.
Across culture.
Even though it's our heritage for all of us.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's something that I think that if you look at how, for instance, most of the Greek gods are gods who are with the polis, who support the polis, the city and the city state. Dionysius remained somebody who was not in good in good terms with the state.
Married to one city. He-
Exactly. And when you look at that and you consider history and you think we have examples like Egypt and Rome where we have either the syncretism of, oh wow, your god reminds me very much of our god. So Hermes really reminds me of Mercury. So they're the same god. And we'll have
Mhm.
Hermes' statue up there too, because that's great. Or you have the Egyptians who also would acquire gods that they respected and find
Mhm.
similarities between them. Now, how does this get replaced all over in the pagan world and the Abrahamic world, everywhere? How does it get replaced with my way is the only way and we will kill each other until somebody wins? Politics. And so it's so interesting that the most primal spiritual story, or whatever you want to call it, is hostile to politics
Yeah.
and is a source of unity in all religions.
Exactly, exactly, and that's why Sufism, they try to be cross, like Judaism, cross Christianity. They try to assimilate the similar idea inside Islam, because Islam, like traditionally, Islam is very strict.
Yeah.
They want nothing to do with Christian other than recognizing Jesus as a prophet,
Yeah.
and they don't want to do anything with Judaism other than some good prophets, though are
Yeah.
rightly. But Sufism, they try to incorporate this wine, intoxication, music, harmony,
Hmm.
illogical, unconscious part, deep-seated, indestructible. Like these language are very similar, surprisingly, and
Yeah.
many people will get surprised that, oh no, Islam is such a strict monotheistic. We don't have anything to do with Dionysus or anything Greek culture. But if you dig deeper, you see there are some thread across culture you
Yeah.
cannot deny.
Yeah. I mean, I've even struck, this is maybe pushing it a little, but if you look at somebody like Rabia,
Yeah,
who's got her torch and she's looking for truth, and she's almost a Maenad in a way. I mean, she's so antisocial, and but yet she's the absolute symbol of
devotee
exactly that you have your soul is one, but they divide it into lower and higher. Lower is the part of your soul that keeps this
going.
working and
Exactly.
makes it, keeps it going, and deals with the world out here. It's your day-to-day consciousness and your unconscious. The higher soul is never immersed in this. It knows what it is, which is a pure consciousness.
Mhm.
And when you live in the lower soul, you have a claustrophobic, fearful experience of life. You're identified with the body. You feel frail. You feel that the world is a big, crazy, chaotic place where anything can happen. It feels like the world goes on, but you won't. And all these feelings that create anger and fear and sadness and alienation and most importantly, obsession with death.
Exactly.
The reason for that obsession with death is the soul longs for freedom. It longs to be away from this claustrophobia of keeping
And
these millions of
also
ex
permanence. So
yes,
for permanence, but it doesn't know that it is already permanent because his
exactly.
lower self
Exactly.
restricting to see. So it's like analogous. For example, suppose a light is reflecting in the mirror and goes to the wall, and the wall portion of the illuminated part is the lower self. They don't see the source is the identical, it's just the body reflects the lower self, but the
Yes.
higher self is not worried because it already knows that everything is included. The lower self is already included. The only problem is the lower self. The
Yes.
lower self has to recognize that I'm just not a separate entity, it's the continuum of the original
Yes.
self.
Yes. And
And
when you achieve that,
Mhm.
then the way you relate to life is completely different. You
And
love it. You
I don't
accept the mystery.
I have to just do the right thing in front of me and enjoy the life.
That's
There's
right.
nothing else to go.
Yeah.
So that part I understood after listening to Manly Hall, that actually you are not going anywhere because wherever you want to go, you don't, either you will not like it or it might not be real. The only real stuff is here already.
Is in this present moment.
Exactly.
Very welcome. And I'm certainly willing to speak with you anytime about him or anything else.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll be in touch with you
Okay.
and email you. And if I find something interesting that aligns with your view, I'll study it first. Then I'll invite you to talk. For example, I studied a little bit about Dionysus before talking with you. Actually, it helped me to participate. Otherwise, I'll be just a listener, right?
Well, you did a beautiful job. You were able to go to some very deep levels, and I appreciate that you did that.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll meet again. And thank you
Yes,
so much.
indeed. Thank
Okay.
you.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.
You too.